Congressman from New York, Mondaire Jones, and Republican political strategist Alice Stewart. Alice, let me start with you. As Lauren said, small, vocal minority against continuing the funding. McCarthy has said he supports Ukraine, but no blank check, no rubber stamp. To make that real, he's going to have to say no to something that the president wants for Ukraine, right? How does he navigate this period, and how much influence will that vocal minority have?
Look, again, as Lauren said, this is small but very vocal, and they're getting a great deal of attention. But most of the Republicans that I speak with want to continue to support Ukraine. I look at this, as Zelensky has said, this is not charity. This is an investment in global security and democracy. And the more we can continue to support Ukraine, it not only helps Ukraine, but neighboring countries. If Putin were to succeed in Ukraine, he will move to other countries, and that is damaging to America. But what Republicans I'm talking with, the more rational Republicans, they have some concerns in terms of just not knowing where the money is going and how it's being spent. And they're simply asking for more accountability. And they also say that it's not without question that if Zelensky wants to continue to receive money from the United States, he should be more than willing to just be more vocal and more upfront about exactly how the money is being spent. And if those questions are answered, then many Republicans won't have any issue with it. But just a little more transparency in how the money is being allocated.
So, Alice, sticking with you, that's how you feel. That's how maybe even the majority of the Republican Party feels right now. But you've got people like Ron DeSantis saying publicly that he doesn't believe that Russia or Putin is a threat to NATO at all. And it does beg the question, what is the Republican specific policy regarding Ukraine?
Well, clearly, the policy and the feeling by Republicans is that we do need to support Ukraine. And look, in terms of how Putin plays into this and now potentially China, Republicans say we shouldn't be making policy decisions based on whether or not we're going to poke the bear of Putin and China, and need to be making the decisions with regard to Ukraine based on Ukraine alone, and making sure that we continue the support, provided that there is an accounting for that money, and then that money will continue.
Mondaire, more Americans support the U.S. continuing to give weapons to Ukraine than not, but that number's slipping from a few months ago at 60% down to 48% now. This is a president who will very likely be running for re-election soon. If this trend continues, does that hinder his argument to Americans, especially when in 2020 he ran against funding these forever wars?
Well, thus far, this isn't a forever war, and it's more clearly than other wars that we've gotten into, frankly, over the past several decades, an issue of national security. Not only is Ukraine an ally of ours, but we know that Vladimir Putin's ambitions do not end at Ukraine, and they don't begin there either, really. He is someone who would love to restore what used to be the Soviet Union. And he's not going to stop there. And we have to be very vigilant about this. I worry when I hear so many people on the Republican side, and unfortunately, it's not just a vocal minority in the House of Representatives, it's the standard bearer of the Republican Party. Donald Trump has repeatedly called U.S. support for the free people of Ukraine into question. And so we got to get on the same page when it comes to this stuff. And I think to the extent we see any support among the American people slipping, it's because there's not that kind of unity of message that typically we have seen, at least in the context of foreign policy, across the ideological spectrum, both Democrats and Republicans. I think this president can run, in fact, for re-election on his success thus far in keeping Russia from completely overtaking Ukraine, which is what many people thought would happen early on in the war.
Yeah, so Mondaire, as much as we would all love for this war to end as soon as possible, no serious person I know that's following it closely believes that it will end anytime this year, at least. We could be here next year and still covering it, sadly. There had been a progressive group of Democrats last summer who had written a letter to then Speaker Pelosi suggesting that Ukrainians should come to the negotiating table. They, of course, rescinded that letter. But are there any pockets of your own party now that you think may be sounding the same alarm that some Republicans are that we just talked to Alice about?
No, I appreciate that you bring up this particular letter, because it's one I happen to be intimately familiar with. I regret that people in the media misinterpreted the purpose of that letter, which was simply to say, hey guys, let's not forget diplomacy. Let's not forget that we ought to be reminding both Ukraine and Russia every chance we get that we're willing to help them get to the table and negotiate in good faith. And of course, from my perspective, and I think from the perspective of anyone who supports U.S. Intervention in this effort, and in particular supporting the free people of Ukraine, that doesn't necessarily mean giving any portion of the sovereign country of Ukraine to the Russians. But it is to say that the American people have an interest, I think, in not funding this in perpetuity if we can come to some kind of negotiated agreement before then. So I wouldn't put people who sign on to that letter in the same category as folks who want to stop supporting Ukraine.
Alice, there have been some Republicans who've joined Democrats in commending the president for his visit to Ukraine, also for his speech in Warsaw. But I want you to listen now to former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley at a campaign stop.
Can we first acknowledge the fact that, yes, Biden's over in Poland, but shouldn't he be with those people in Ohio? You have to always, during any time of crisis, go to your people immediately.
You agree with that he should have been in Ohio first or instead of the trip to Europe?
Look, I think it was extremely important for the president to be in Poland. I was recently in Warsaw, and these people are really sacrificing a lot to help the people of Ukraine with humanitarian efforts as well as financial help. So showing Poland support was extremely critical. As far as the president going to the train derailment, I think it's important, whether it's him or now we understand that Secretary Buttigieg is on the way there. I feel like there was a missed opportunity to go to the site earlier on and show federal help. It's great that we're getting federal financial help to that region, but oftentimes the optics of seeing someone, whether it is President Biden, whether it's the Vice President or Secretary Buttigieg, being on the ground, meeting face to face with those people and reinforcing the financial support with the human kindness, that would have gone a long way. But I don't take away him being in Poland. I think that was important, but making sure that we have a high-level federal official on the ground there, I think will go a long way.
Yeah, a reminder that the president didn't just choose to go to Poland just this week. I mean, this week is the anniversary marking Russia's invasion as well. That is important to note. Mondaire Jones and Alice Stewart, thank you.